Hi, my name's Clark. I'm a game developer, musician, and sound designer, and I'm currently looking for a job. I'm confident in my abilities, but how can I instill the same confidence in a potential employer? For musicians and sound designers, a portfolio is a great first step, so I figured that's where I'd start. While I was brainstorming, I had an idea. Why not make a portfolio that is a game? I'm a programmer as well, after all, and that's an important part of my skill set I'd like to demonstrate. As I thought about it more, I realized having a project function as a game and portfolio poses some unique challenges that normal game development may not encounter. How do I create enough variety to show off my flexibility without making something so long a potential employer doesn't have time to see it all? How can I make this variety feel cohesive? As I considered these challenges, I thought it could be fun and interesting to document my journey. So welcome to the first devlog of my portfolio that is a game. With the project intended to deviate from the standard of what a game is, thorough and thoughtful planning was the clear first step. Beyond concept documentation and defining my minimum viable product, I needed to find a way to resolve the contradictions between a functioning game and a portfolio that demonstrates my abilities in a way I'm satisfied with. As I continued thinking about this problem, it started to feel very familiar. I have a solution, a complete product, and two variables, being a fun game and a comprehensive portfolio. To solve this equation, we need to solve for one variable, and in this case, I believe the most elegant solution is to solve for the comprehensive portfolio. In other words, what rules need to be followed to ensure that any game I create within them also fulfills everything I want out of a portfolio? The first thing I'd like my portfolio to be is varied but cohesive, as I alluded to earlier. A video portfolio makes this easy. It doesn't ask anything of the viewer. Watching a clip of a cutscene takes no more skill than watching a clip of gameplay, for example. For a game, adding variety runs the risk of asking too much of the player, confusing or frustrating them, and severing the perception of continuity. I wanted to tackle this problem with the first two rules, and came up with the following. 1. The player must always control the same player character. And 2. Changes in gameplay style must be directly connected, and contribute meaningfully to the overarching narrative. So let's break these down. The first rule, the player must always control the same player character, is intended to reduce that possible confusion caused by adding variation. As an example, if I wanted to have a section that's a 3D platformer, followed by a section of racing, the racing section should be on foot to avoid the player having to transition from controlling a person to controlling a car. This includes the controls and how the player interacts with the world. Should the player move and interact with WASD in one section, they shouldn't be given another key such as E to do something in another section. I'm hoping following this rule will help me design variety that also allows the player to carry over and apply knowledge from previous gameplay sections, and minimize the amount of learning they need to do. The second rule is in two parts, the first one being changes in gameplay style must be directly connected. By this, I mean any transition should be something the player sees. Going back to the earlier example, just having the 3D platformer section cut off and the racing section start wouldn't be allowed. The player character should be seen leaving the platformer section and starting to run in the race before giving the player control. The idea behind this is to give the player time to see that the last thing they were doing is over and something new is happening. It should also give them some time to anticipate what they may need to do when they regain control. The second part, stating that a change must contribute meaningfully to the overarching narrative, is intended to help me avoid designing sections that may feel more or less important than another during gameplay. If all of the elements make sense in the story being told and contribute to it not only in setting but gameplay, hopefully the player won't be confused as to why something is happening and lose their immersion. The next thing I want my portfolio game to be is accessible. Video portfolios also make this pretty easy, and I think the accessibility level of a video is a great place to aim despite being somewhat unrealistic. This desire did help me decide a few technical things. I'll be using Unity as a game engine for its WebGL support, for example, but there are other design choices I can make to lower the barriers of entry. The rules I created are the following. 1. Any gameplay designed to represent a specific genre should use well-known tropes and mechanics from that genre. And 2. A full playthrough of the final product should take a similar amount of time to complete as a standard video portfolio, within reason. These rules start to get more complicated and directly influence design philosophy, so let's break them down. The first rule is intended to minimize the amount of time a player spends trying to understand what they need to do instead of doing it. While unique mechanics are the backbone of many great new games, having to teach them to a player introduces some variation that's out of my control. If I were to make a cool and unique mechanic, each player may take a different amount of time to grasp it, making the second rule nearly impossible to follow. Since I know my audience is people who are experienced with games, I want to be able to lean on their prior knowledge and expectations. For the second rule, I want the final product to take a relatively short amount of time to complete, to maximize the amount of players that complete it. I don't believe limiting it to the length of a standard video portfolio is reasonable, as this format lets me demonstrate more skills than a video would. However, the project would fail as a portfolio if a potential employer sat down to play it and couldn't see everything I wanted to demonstrate because I was asking more time from them than they're available to give. Following these rules should result in a game that provides everything I want as a portfolio as well. However, to measure this success, I'll have to include some checks in future playtests and evaluations. Before I can get to that, I need to solidify my concepts and develop concrete prototypes to test with. Following the rules, I came up with a story containing 3 different gameplay styles, all intended to last around 3 minutes each. The player is an archaeologist adventurer type, like Indiana Jones, who's trying to retrieve some treasure or artifact to study. The first style of gameplay is a top-down stealth section, where the player needs to distract the guards in order to sneak around and grab the artifact unnoticed. Upon successfully stealing it, the alarms are set off and the guards chase the player into the street, where the second section begins, an endless runner. The player must stop the guards from chasing them, while dodging obstacles. Once the guards are off the player's tail, they arrive at their lab, where they begin to try and unlock the treasure. With no key, the player character uses some shrinking mechanism to shrink themselves and enter the keyhole, and the third section begins, a side-scrolling puzzle platformer to unlock the chest. Upon completion, the player returns to regular size, the treasure is revealed, and the game is complete. I think these 3 gameplay styles give me the perfect amount of variation I'm looking for. The story justification for the platforming section feels admittedly weak, so I'll have to keep working on that one, but for the time being I feel it's serviceable. With rules to design around and defined gameplay styles, let's start writing some code. For this prototype, I started off with the player character, a blue cube. I figured a lot of the movement code would be reusable, so that's what I wrote first. I got the player moving forward at a fixed speed, and able to move left and right without being able to go out of bounds. I also gave the player a little hopping animation to convey running, which I find quite charming. Next, I created a red cube to act as an enemy. I made the enemy follow behind the player at a distance that can be changed, made it hop, and follow the player's lane changes. Now it needs to be able to catch up to the player. I decided the enemy will get closer to the player when they run into an obstacle, so we need to create something for them to run into. I made it so that the player can move right through the obstacle to not interrupt the pace of gameplay, but upon colliding with it, the enemy moves one space closer. At this point, I hadn't created any lose state, and I found it pretty funny that the enemy could get overzealous and outrun the player. Next, I wanted some way to defeat an enemy, so I had the idea of dropping something for them to run into. This added some much needed challenge in deciding when to drop the item, since if you drop it and then have to switch lanes, the enemy will follow you moving out of the way of the item. I decided the item should be a bomb, so it'd hopefully be easy for the player to understand what it does. The next thing to think about is making the runner endless. Right now, the player and enemy will run off into space after reaching the end of the land strip. My first solution was to create warp points that would send you back to the beginning of the land strip, creating the illusion of endlessness. I started to work on this solution, but upon opening the project for the second day, I realized that the illusion only works in this bare setting. The solution I ended up coming up with was to create a class I called Level Segment. Each segment has their own obstacle layout and bomb spawns. They also have a reference to every other type of segment, and a trigger for the player to hit. Once the player crosses the trigger, a new segment is chosen at random and spawned, and the current one starts a timer for when to destroy itself. I ended up making 4 different segments and ended work for that day. On my third and final day working on this prototype, I wrapped up on the gameplay elements, did a bit of balancing, and added some polish. The last gameplay elements I needed were multiple enemies, a win state for when the player eliminated all 3, and a lose state for when the enemies caught up to the player. All 3 were easy enough to implement, and with them finished, I felt the prototype had every feature I wanted. I started looking for bugs, and while I was playing, I noticed I was having a really hard time staying alive. The level segments I had made the previous day were much too difficult. I worked a little bit on rebalancing the segments by removing some obstacles and leaving bigger spaces between groups of obstacles. I found the experience was much more in line with what I was looking for after these changes. I also realized that I knew the items were bombs because I said they were, but somebody playing for the first time would likely have a hard time figuring out what they are or what they do. To alleviate this, I added an explosion when the enemy runs into a bomb, as well as some sparks coming off the bomb overhead when the player is holding one. Finally, I realized this gameplay style is the only one that uses an input to do something other than move the player. I added a button prompt above the player when they're holding a bomb, so they know which button to use. With that extra bit of polish, I decided everything I wanted out of this prototype was finished, so I decided to move on. For the puzzle platformer, I didn't really know what I wanted the puzzle mechanic to be going into it, but I was inspired by the story element of the player being inside a keyhole, and had the idea of the player trying to weigh down the springs inside to press them like a key would. I decided on a physics-based, box-pushing puzzle. At this point, I was getting pretty comfortable with Unity, and the prototype only took me 2 days. I started on the first day with the character again, and got 2D movement and jumping working. Next, I started working on the boxes the player can push. Since the rigid body component takes care of all of the physics, I just needed to tag them so that other objects can use that tag when deciding on how to interact with them. Next, I started work on the object the player is trying to get the box to. I called them tumblers internally, but I'm pretty sure the individual spring and tooth inside a keyhole isn't what a tumbler is. I made the tumbler move a box inside of it once the box crosses a trigger, and once the required amount of boxes are inside the tumbler, it sets itself to a solved state. I started the second day brainstorming how to make puzzles out of these ideas. I realized that because the player can only push a box, if you push one into a wall, it would get stuck, and you'd be soft-locked. I thought about making it so that if a box touched a wall, it would just be reset to its default position, but that seemed too confusing and needlessly limiting to the player and myself in designing puzzles. My solution was creating an object I call a box destroyer, which I think of as a cube of lava or something. It destroys a box on contact, sending it back to its default position. At first, I was skeptical about this solving my problem, but I later realized that it not only solves the problem, but allows me to create some unique puzzle designs around boxes being intentionally pushed into a wall. I also added a door to the tumbler that opens when solved, and with that I was able to start designing puzzles. Since a rule of 3 was influencing other aspects of the project, I decided to create 3 puzzles, starting with one that should teach the player anything they can't figure out about the mechanics by looking. I started the player in a path that's 1 block tall, only allowing them to move horizontally, and put a box on their right. Since the player can't progress by moving to the left, I intend for them to move to the right and see the box can be pushed. It's not possible for them to leave the path without pushing the box into the tumbler and see the platform being weighed down as well. I put a box with the destroyer on each side on top of the path. I'm hoping the elevation will encourage the player to try jumping. This box also serves as a place to see how the box destroyer works. Finally, the puzzle can be solved by jumping up again and pushing the highest box off the edge, which should fall into the tumbler and open the door. I designed the next puzzle around using boxes as platforms to reach otherwise unreachable heights. I wasn't sure what else to do with the idea, but I didn't want to introduce another way of thinking about boxes in this puzzle, so I made the solution symmetrical. This is one I'm interested in playtesting. Hopefully it won't be boring that both necessary boxes are successfully reached in the same way. The third puzzle is the largest, and based around the idea I mentioned earlier, purposely getting boxes stuck on a wall. Doing this on the left side creates the necessary height to get the first box into the tumbler. The right side of the puzzle is a similar idea, however the box needs to follow the correct path to reach the tumbler. This puzzle is the one I'm the most proud of, as it reminds me of those Escort the Shell levels you often find in Mario Maker. Once the third puzzle is solved, this gameplay section is complete. Despite being the last prototype I'm talking about, the stealth section is the first one I worked on. Since I needed some time to get experienced with Unity, I decided to just focus on that and not document the progress throughout. Despite that inexperience, I am proud of how this one turned out. The player is able to move in 4 directions, and an intro cutscene establishes the goal of stealing the artifact. I wanted a way for the player to be able to distract the guards, since that's a staple of stealth games, but after the movement I didn't have any buttons left to use. My solution was buttons on the ground that light up specific lamps. Should a guard see a lamp lit, they will leave their route, go investigate, go to the button to turn it off, and then return to their route. I gave the player a safe space to start out and get acquainted with their movement. hopefully realizing their speed, as well as that they're on a grid. Just outside the starting area, the first guard patrols a hallway that's one space wide, so the player can't just walk past. On the way to the hall, the player is forced to step on the first button, illuminating the lamp and triggering the guard to go check it out, clearing the way. Should the player catch on and move past fast enough, they know everything they need to know to finish this section. On his way to turn the light off, the guard looks directly down both paths the player could be if they aren't fast enough, so they will learn that the guards leave their route to go turn lights off, and that they can be caught. I created 2 more encounters like this, each intended to be a bit tighter and more difficult. Now that I have 3 prototypes working, what's next? I think the next step is to design and run playtests so I can see what works and what doesn't, in terms of gameplay as well as my design philosophy and process. Did all the planning help me achieve what I want inside and outside of the game? Do all these rules work? They definitely helped me with direction and making choices, but whether or not those choices influence the experience as intended is something I'd like playtesting to answer. It's inevitable that something will go wrong or not as planned, and I think it's interesting and potentially useful to think about. So what do I expect to go wrong? Firstly, bugs. There are a lot of bugs in the prototypes that have the potential to derail a playtest entirely. The player can sometimes move into a wall and can't get out in the stealth section. The hit detection on obstacles can be confusing in the runner section. Sometimes the player can double jump in the platformer. Should a playtester get stuck and have to restart a section, I can't use that test as valid data for how long that section takes, since the player's no longer starting from total unfamiliarity. Something else I expect to go wrong is difficulty. While I was intentional about teaching the player, even though the mechanics are simple, I expect playtesters may find the sections, or at least part of them, much harder than I'd like. I'm sure many things I never anticipated will arise during playtesting, so the biggest focus for my playtest design is flexibility, to ensure that we can keep as many of the tests as relevant as possible. Thank you for sticking through to the end of the video. This is the first devlog I've ever made, and I put a lot of work into it on top of the project itself. If you're interested in the project and would like to stay up to date, please consider subscribing. It's the best way to show support and interest.